Hey guys, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we will be watching First Crusade Battle of Manzikert 1071 by Kings and Generals. So, this is pretty far outside the wheelhouse of our normal reactions. We haven't really talked about anything relating to the Crusades, nor do I know too much about the Crusades, but I do find them very interesting. And I'm excited to learn, particularly from Kings and Generals, who always do a good job with their videos. So yeah, let's jump right into this reaction.
The Eastern Roman Empire entered the 11th century with one of its greatest warrior emperors, but by the end, it would take on a path of crisis and decay. It was an ongoing process, peaking at the decisive Battle of Manzikert in 1071. But how did a single defeat, under the leadership of a capable general against a heavily outnumbered enemy, lead to the loss of the imperial heartland? This is the fascinating story of the events that defined the history of the Eastern Mediterranean and turned a regional conflict into a religious one. Welcome to the first video in our series on the First Crusade.
Yeah, we haven't talked about the Crusades or really anything to do with them on this channel, but we have talked about the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire. We've done a lot on Justinian and mainly Belisarius. Of course, they were operating hundreds of years before this, and a lot has changed since then. Though some familiar trends arise. The Eastern Roman Empire has faced a massive decline in power. It faces challenges from its neighbors, particularly the Muslims of the East, the Arab tribes of the East. The Arab tribes had been threatening the Byzantine Empire for hundreds of years, although, at this point, I'm not sure if the Turks have emerged as a threat yet, and what role the Caliphate plays, I'm not quite sure, because I'm not too familiar with this era. But basically, there's a lot of Muslim challenges to Byzantine power in the East, and they're struggling to hold them off. And, we're sort of getting into that in this series.
It is the gift-giving season, and if you're looking for a great present for yourself or your loved ones, you don't need to look further than the sponsor of this video, Kamikoto, who provide great Japanese steel knives to solve every cooking situation.
They look very nice. Shout out to Kings and Generals. This video is linked down below. Please go check it out. And please go check out their sponsor. We like to show love to the original creators. So, go check them out and all that good stuff.
Tapping into more than 800 years of traditional techniques from Japan, and using only Japanese steel, Kamikoto created perfect steel knives for your culinary needs. Each Kamikoto knife goes through a rigorous 19-step process that takes several years from start to finish to complete. Experienced bladesmiths hone and shape raw steel into hardy blades, polishing and sharpening them to an excruciatingly fine edge. Each knife is individually inspected and comes with a lifetime guarantee. Because of their single bevel edge, Kamikoto knives can achieve an unbelievably sharp edge you just can't get with other knives, and they're used by several chefs working at Michelin star restaurants. We can't recommend Kamikoto knives.
I don't think I've ever seen a knife ad on YouTube. That's pretty unique. I'll give them that. It stands out just in that respect. Okay. Go check them and their sponsor out and, show some love.
The reign of Basil II was the pinnacle of the Eastern Roman Empire, as this emperor of the Macedonian dynasty was a true warrior, capable administrator, and cunning diplomat, who managed to endure civil war, defeats, and corruption to eventually crush.
Wow. Like I said, I do not know that much at all about this period of Byzantine history. I will say, it looks like Basil has control of quite a lot of territory. What I do know is that the Eastern Roman Empire, their control of territory was very much up and down over the years. It was not, there was a decline over the centuries, but it wasn't necessarily just straight downwards. Sometimes they would be more powerful and control more land. Other times, they would struggle and control less lands. But it looks like under Basil, they were doing pretty well.
crush his enemies, including the Fatimids, Georgia, Khazars, and most notably Bulgaria, which he conquered in 1018. When he was not campaigning, Basil wrote laws, established the Varangian Guard, and allied the Kievan Rus under the condition that they accept Orthodox Christianity.
Okay, wow. Basil II was doing a lot. I mean, one, defeated the Bulgarians. The Bulgars were a big rival of the Byzantines for hundreds and hundreds of years. He wouldn't permanently defeat them. They would come back, but that's a pretty impressive feat, and introduced Orthodox Christianity to the Kievan Rus. I mean, that is something which no one could have known how impactful that would be. Of course, the Kievan Rus would evolve into modern Russia, and Orthodox Christianity would become very important to Russia, and Russia would become a very important defender of Orthodox Christianity. So, some pretty impactful stuff.
The man who would later be nicknamed the Bulgar Slayer would reign for 49 years and leave behind a vast treasury for his successors, all of which would live in the shadow of his memory. The first of these would be Constantine VIII, who ruled for 3 short years, and despite being in his late 60s, he spent most of his time hunting, feasting, and blinding nobles. Factionalism and court intrigues during his reign showed the cracks in the empire. While he was on his deathbed, he attempted to marry his daughter Zoe to the capable military commander and loyal Duke of Antioch, Constantine. But as the man made his way to the capital, the royal advisors changed the selection to the old and feeble Romanos III, who was easier to control, which was a sign that the empire now preferred court intrigue and plotting to merit and good leadership. Romanos took the throne in 1028 and was eager to prove his worth, so he...
Yeah, well, that was, as far as I'm aware, quite the long-standing issue of the Byzantine Empire. I mean, it had been an issue for hundreds of years, and it would continue to be an issue. Sort of the court intrigue, plotting, all of that kind of stuff would often take precedent over a more meritocratic selection of leadership. This isn't unique to the Eastern Roman Empire. It does seem like it may have been particularly bad, though they survived for quite a while, so, interpret that as you will.
He decided to attack his own client state of Aleppo in July, but that ended in a catastrophic failure, as 20,000 of his men died of heat, thirst, and dysentery. Meanwhile, Empress Zoe was hatching her own plots, spying on her sister Theodora, and in her desperation to get pregnant at the age of 50, took on many lovers, while using magic charms, amulets, and potions to no avail. In 1034, Zoe had her husband drowned in the bath, marrying one of her low-born lovers named Michael on the very same day.
Wow.
The new emperor, Michael IV, was scared of Zoe and knew what she was capable of, so he had her confined to her chambers whilst doing his best to restore the strength of the empire. His rule saw significant improvements in the...
shout out to Michael. He was kind of thrust into this position, but, it looks like he's trying his best. A note on, the court intrigue and all that kind of stuff, as we can see, Zoe wielded a significant amount of power. I don't know this situation in particular, but in general, court politics was one of the ways in which noble and important women throughout history had an element of control and power, because at least, in the Roman Empire, in the Eastern Roman Empire, in Europe, women often lacked power compared to men. Men held the reins of power in many aspects of life, but, the court was an area in which women could have a lot of control. In these, dynastic dramas, these court intrigues, plots, all that kind of stuff. This was an area in which women could wield power, as we saw there. Though, it could backfire sometimes, though sometimes women would manage to hold, positions of power for a long time. Though they would often have to do it through a man, a husband, a son, whatever. So they still couldn't hold power independently, but they could do it sort of behind the scenes to a certain extent.
The economic sector, as well as a great victory over the Bulgarians, who started a major revolt. But neither of those achievements could directly be attributed to him. On the administrative side, there was John the Eunuch, who managed the finances, while the famous Viking Harald Hardrada was the man leading the Varangians to victory in 1041, earning himself the nickname the Bulgar Burner.
Well, how about that? I've definitely heard of Harald Hardrada. I don't know much, if anything, about him. I just know he's a famous Viking. I definitely did not expect him to pop up here. That sounds, frankly, fascinating. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that if anyone could let me know or has a video to recommend or something. That sounds really interesting.
Meanwhile, the emperor became ill and began to shower the clergy with gifts to both appease them and find a cure, as countless generals wondered why this commoner got on the throne in the first place. Michael IV died a natural death at the end of the year and was succeeded by his nephew, Michael V, marking the first time in half a century when the empire was not ruled by an old monarch. However, the tradition of being ruled by an incompetent monarch continued, as Michael immediately arrested Harald Hardrada, banished his uncle John, and later his adoptive mother, Empress Zoe, sparking a major revolt in the capital and causing a mob to raise both Macedonian sisters, Zoe and Theodora, as empresses, while the future...
Yeah, I mean, this was a very common trend throughout Eastern Roman history. As I mentioned, there was a lot of dynastic drama. There were many different dynasties and many different people who held some legitimacy, some claim to the throne. So oftentimes they wouldn't be executed because, God isn't really a fan of that. So they would be sent away, often sent to exile or sent into monasteries. And as we're seeing here, Theodora was dragged out of her monastery and crowned against her will. Oftentimes, these people who held this legitimacy were not interested in leadership. They just wanted to survive and live their life in the monastery. Mobs would drag them out, particularly if they were in Constantinople, and crown them, but just as a revolt against the ruling monarch, which would often lead these figures to be executed, even if they were not interested in leading such a revolt. But we're seeing a lot of this dynastic drama playing out here, which played out many times throughout Byzantine history.
King of Norway blinded Michael, ending his 4-month-long reign.
Wow.
The sisters now ruled the empire, but before long factions began to form around them, and they schemed against each other until Zoe decided to marry for the third time. Many candidates and former lovers were reviewed, but eventually she settled on Constantine Monomachos, and if the constant coronation sounds confusing, that's because it was. More importantly, the tradition of handing out huge gifts at the coronation ceremony to earn the loyalty of followers exhausted the rich treasury Basil left behind. Shortly after their wedding, Constantine IX brought in his mistress Maria and exalted her to the status of empress, convincing Zoe to share her throne and her bed with this woman, leading to a convoluted situation where the Eastern Roman Empire had an emperor and 3 empresses who were about to face a wave of new and old opponents.
Yeah, this is obviously pretty ridiculous. The struggle over the throne, just very complex, difficult to understand. From my perspective in the modern world, seemingly quite unnecessary. There's no need for it to be this complicated, but with all the power struggles and legitimacy crises, this is kind of what happened.
The Byzantine holdings in Italy were crumbling under the wave of Norman invasions. Bulgaria was conquered, but it no longer served as the barrier to other nomadic people, which allowed the Pechenegs to cross the Danube and harass the Balkans. The Kievan Rus launched a huge invasion in 1043, which was stopped with the use of Greek fire. Despite all of these enemies and 2 major failed rebellions, the empire continued to expand, annexing the Armenian Kingdom of Ani, a mountainous region that would have made for a good buffer state against the avalanche of Seljuk conquests. Nomadic military traditions met Sunni Islam, and the combination, fueled by the concept of jihad, unleashed itself on the Islamic world.
I mean, before we get into that, you can see all the threats that the Eastern Roman Empire faced. Now, think about all of that, but it, happens basically for about 1,000 years is, I think, around the length of the Eastern Roman Empire. Not exactly, but they faced constant challenges and threats. So it's honestly pretty remarkable that the Byzantines managed to stick around for so long with all these challenges that they constantly faced from every direction. At times, I'm sure it seemed like the empire was about to collapse, but it didn't. I mean, until it did. It managed to survive for a really long time. Of course, there was, a long decline of the Byzantine Empire before it did eventually fall.
Where despite being seen as barbarians by some, the undeniable military prowess of the Seljuks helped them unify most of the Middle East. They now turned their gaze on the Orthodox Romans and Shiite Fatimids.
And now we're getting sort of some conflict within Islam. And we're seeing the rise of the Seljuk Turks. And, we would see the Turks just in general. Well, the Turks in general would be very important and were very important. The Byzantines were conquered eventually by the Ottoman Turks. So we're sort of seeing the rise of, Muslim Turk power.
Constantine's reign ended in 1055 with another calamity that would leave a permanent mark on the empire, the East-West Schism. The throne passed to the only surviving member of the Macedonian dynasty, Theodora, who tried to centralize power, while the court engaged in intrigues and plots. Her death a year later would bring an end to 189 years of rule under the dynasty. Naturally, civil war ensued, and after it, Michael VI and Isaac Komnenos ruled for a year each, until Constantine X Ducas got his chance to start a dynasty. The court was purged, gifts and titles were once again handed out. Meanwhile, the enemies of the empire were only growing stronger. In particular, the Seljuks themselves just had a change in leadership after the founder of the empire Tugril died and was succeeded by his nephew Alparslan. The nomads derived their legitimacy from military success, so the new sultan decided to prove himself by leading an expedition against the city of Ani, which was one of the largest cities in the world at the time.
Wow. Frankly, I have never heard of it. But, I know nothing about this period, so that's not surprising. There is a lot going on. We're covering a lot of history right now, a large area. So, there is, I feel like I've, just been dropped into the middle of it, which I have. But yeah, there is a ton going on. We're seeing constant changes in Eastern Roman leadership. We're seeing them expanding while still facing countless challenges at home. And now we're seeing a change of leadership within the Seljuk Empire and how that affects sort of their actions.
Despite its riches and dense population, its corrupted governor stole gold from the defense budget, and when the Seljuks arrived, they found a section of the city wall unguarded and pounced, subjecting it to a brutal sack in 1064. The last time the Eastern Romans suffered a defeat of this caliber was all the way back in 838, when Amorium was sacked by the Abbasids. Yet Constantinople's only response was not to send an army and pick up the pieces, but to prosecute members of the Armenian clergy, while focusing entirely on the Italian lands they were losing. This complete lack of interest in the eastern frontier was coupled with a disintegration of the professional army, decreased army salaries, lack of repairs on border forts, and reliance on mercenaries.
These are, like I said, I don't know much about this era in particular, but I do know that many of these issues were, sort of chronic issues for the Eastern Roman Empire. I mean, with such a large empire, it makes sense that you're not going to be able to focus on everything at once. So oftentimes when the government was focusing on the West, they would ignore the East, and vice versa. They were always struggling to pay for the army. At least from what I can tell, this seems to have been a really consistent struggle throughout the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. They also seem to have struggled to keep up border defenses. This is another thing that we'll see throughout Eastern Roman history. So, they're facing a lot of these issues that they have faced for hundreds of years, and they will face for hundreds of more years.
Yet it was once again the final act written from his deathbed that was the most influential in the 8-year-long reign of Constantine X. Desperate to keep his dynasty in charge, the dying emperor made his wife Eudokia swear an oath in front of all court officials that she would take no future husband and rule as regent until their son could assume the throne. At this point in time, a massive Seljuk raid penetrated deep into Byzantine territory, and the important city of Khazaria was sacked, while the empress discovered a plot by the Duke of Serdica, Romanos, that quickly made her break the oath she swore. Knowing how fragile her position was, and unlike her husband, understanding the importance of keeping the nomadic raiders at bay, she turned to the now imprisoned Romanos and made him an offer. The man was to marry her and defend the empire against its enemies, or die. This was a wise choice, considering the many noble families plotting to seize power for themselves, most notably Constantine's brother John, who, as many notable generals in the past, would defeat their foes only to gain confidence and rebel against the crown.
That's a pretty typical story. I mean, yeah, Constantine X wants Eudokia to, rule as a regent until their son can rule in his own name. He wants to keep their dynasty alive, but he's frankly naive if he thinks that can happen. I think she was correct to try and increase her own power and bring Romanos into the picture, because I'm not sure how old their son was at this point, but there's probably no way she would have been able to rule as a regent for the several years that she needed to do so without serious and probably successful challenges to her authority and legitimacy.
Romanos accepted the offer and now owed his life to his empress. He wasted no time in preparing against one of the greatest foes the Romans ever faced. Decades of decay and lack of funds had turned the once fearsome army into a mob of peasants and undisciplined mercenaries, which the new emperor had to drill into a competent fighting force. In 1068, news spread of the plunder of Neo Khazaria, so Romanos set out with a small force and chased the Seljuks for 8 days, until eventually engaging the nomads, slowed down by the loot and slaves they carried. The cargo was abandoned, and the Seljuks rushed back home, making the new emperor confident. Next, he regrouped with the main army to take Hierapolis from the Emirate of Aleppo, wisely avoiding the summer heat, before hearing of yet another raid that sacked Amorium. His first campaign had mixed results, but the soldiers were happy that they finally had a leader who fought alongside them, while his internal enemies did their best to focus on his failures to protect Roman citizens. The following year, another distraction was thrown into the mix, as one of the Norman mercenaries, Robert Crispin, leading a contingent of Frankish troops, rebelled against the empire and attacked tax collectors in Edessa. He was captured and exiled to the island of Abydos, allowing Romanos to continue his fight against the Seljuks.
I mean, and as has basically been mentioned, one of the other issues with ruling such a large empire, large and diverse empire, I should add. I mean, so many different ethnicities, groups of people, interest groups. There is constant internal dissent. The people, many different groups of people are constantly on the verge of rebellion, which obviously doesn't help at all when you're dealing with external threats as well. So it's just a really risky game to play.
A large army went on to secure Aklat on Lake Van, while a smaller force under a sub-commander was ordered to guard the border. That force was overwhelmed, and the Seljuks razed another city.
Yeah, I mean, this is also the thing about fighting against nomads. Romanos is struggling to catch them, and they're raiding, as you can see, like really deep into Roman territory. Compared to him, who, he has this, big, standard, traditional army. They're just going to be, the Seljuks are going to be so much more maneuverable, and that's going to be the major advantage they have over Romanos.
Time Iconium, forcing Romanos to give chase and pick up the abandoned loot after catching up with them. The frustration was building up as traditional tactics proved ineffective against the lighter-armed cavalry force.
Yep.
The Byzantine army was expensive to upkeep and feed, and while the emperor was campaigning, the court was plotting, forcing Romanos to balance his military campaign with administrative duties.
I mean, and I mentioned that the Byzantines were always struggling to pay for their army. It's not necessarily surprising if you think about the time period. This is, the Middle Ages, and armies, we have standing armies right now. They did not have standing armies. If you needed an army in Europe, you would get all your lords together, raise some peasants, and go fight. And when the fighting was done, everyone would go home. The Romans obviously kept up a professional army, when the Roman Empire still existed as a whole, but it had been a long time since then. And this is why it's so expensive for the Byzantines to upkeep their professional army. It's a pretty unique thing at this point. And they need it so much because they're constantly facing challenges, and, they often struggle to find the funds to pay for it.
Because of that, the campaign season of 1070 was entrusted to Manuel Komnenos, nephew of the former Emperor Isaac and elder brother to the future Alexios, while the emperor focused on the loss of Italy and monetary reforms aimed at funding the army. Public events were restricted, the currency was debased from 87 to 70% gold, and
as if you guys don't know what debased means, although they basically just said it there, it's when you have your currency is a gold coin. Debasing it just means that you make it less gold. So your coin is 90% gold. Well, now it's only 85% gold. This is basically inflation, because now if your coin was 100% gold and now it's 50% gold, now you need 2 new coins to be the same value as one old coin. So it's inflation basically.
Court salaries decreased, which hurt his image, but allowed him to gather the resources necessary to raise a significant army, which was needed now more than ever, since Manuel was defeated and captured by a Seljuk general who used the classic feigned retreat maneuver. However, while the noble was held hostage, he convinced the enemy general to change sides and escort Komnenos back to the capital.
Okay, nice.
The combination of active leadership in the east, as well as the defection of a key general, who also happened to be the Sultan's brother-in-law, escalated the conflict. Alp-Arslan was more interested in his war against the Fatimids, as he considered their Shi'ism too heretical to suffer, but he could not neglect the Byzantines anymore.
Isn't that kind of funny? Up until this point, when the Byzantines sort of made it so we had to confront them, he was more concerned with other Muslims, because, they followed a different kind of Islam than he did. It's just kind of funny that oftentimes, infighting amongst ourselves is more, we prioritize it more than fighting against our external enemies. Often the fights that are the most harsh and the most intense are with those who are, to some extent within the same group as us, but in some ways different. Although at this point, the Byzantines have been successful enough that Alp-Arslan is forced to go and confront them instead.
So the Sultan personally led a campaign to the strategic region around Lake Van in September 1070, taking the cities of Manzikert and Alat, before securing the allegiance of the Mawanids and attacking Edessa. the countryside was plundered and the city garrison managed to hold off the attackers, but overall Alp-Arslan got what he came for and could now divert his attention to the real foes in the south, first stopping by the city of Aleppo. The emir of the vassal city was ordered to come out and swear an oath, but he refused, which led to the siege of the city in April 1071. Deciding to use this to his advantage, Romanos quickly gathered his army and marched towards Lake Van in an attempt to retake what was lost. His army included the professional Byzantine corps, as well as Bulgarians, Pechenegs, Oghuz Turks, Armenians and Normans, for a total of 40,000.
I've got some thunder going on outside. But, yeah, it's a pretty sizable force, and a pretty diverse force as well. You know, we have the Byzantine core, but also a lot of different ethnic groups. And, you know, this has been true throughout Byzantine history. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, their empire was a large and diverse one. So they're drawing from a lot of these different groups to support the army, which, you know, is good because you're building a bigger, stronger force. It does also add some instability in because, I mean, one, there can be difficulty with communication. You know, different groups speak different languages. Two, depending on the different groups that make up your army, you could have some issues with insubordination or outright rebellion. I mean, there are Bulgarians in this army. The Bulgarians would forever be a thorn in the side of the Eastern Roman Empire. So, you know, it does complicate the picture a little bit.
Every man was ordered to bring enough provisions for 2 months, which, considering the size of the army and the mountainous region, was critical.
Yeah.
The host reached Lake Van in August, where the emperor divided his army into 2 equal parts in order to cover more ground, ease the logistical strain, and simultaneously capture both Manzikert and Alat, which were a day's march apart from each other. Upon hearing news of this movement, Alp-Arslan abandoned Aleppo in May and rushed towards the lake with incredible speed, even losing many men who drowned crossing the Euphrates.
Wow.
Romanos and his advisors considered this to be an act of panic and assumed the Sultan would need time to gather new recruits from his domain, while in reality, his forced march was able to surprise the secondary contingent sent to take Alat. The Byzantine force panicked and withdrew to Melitene without sending word to Romanos. The Seljuks numbered no more than 20,000 and had just eliminated an equally large and better armed force with their mere presence.
See, the Seljuks are, you know, their forces are half as large as the Byzantine forces combined, but due to their decisive action and gaining the element of surprise, they've already taken an upper hand. So, you know, I guess we'll see how this goes for the Byzantines, but it's not looking great so far. But, you know, they still have a chance to come back. I mean, the battle's, you know, not even close to over.
On the next day, August 25th, 1071, the emperor, who had just taken the city of Manzikert, became aware of the Seljuk presence and was baffled to find out half of his men deserted him. He immediately sent out one of his commanders to push back the riders, assuming it was just a scouting party.
Uh-oh.
The commander engaged the enemy, but after realizing this was the entire Seljuk army, he withdrew and reported back to Romanos with 2 spears sticking out of his armor.
I mean, shout out to him. That is a brave and clearly a tough man.
More troops were sent, but Alp-Arslan once again employed the feigned retreat to avoid casualties and captured a small squadron of men who overextended themselves.
As always, the Byzantines struggle against nomadic opponents. They always did, due to the improved maneuverability of nomadic forces. I mean, they're so quick, they're hard to catch. You know, they can do feigned retreats at a, you know, very rapid pace. Particularly in this case where, you know, half of the Byzantine men have already fled, so now, you know, they're on fairly equal footing. The Eastern Romans are probably in trouble.
Romanos knew that after his reforms and all of the sacked cities, this was his chance to prove himself and eliminate the Eastern threat for good. So he ordered an attack against Alp-Arslan. but by that time the nomads had retreated to a nearby hilltop. The real battle would have to wait, so the Romans went back to their fortified camp just outside Manzikert. Later that evening, the Seljuks launched a devastating raid, taking advantage of the new moon, and harassed whoever was outside the safety of the walls. An eyewitness account reports, "For who could get any sleep when the danger had drawn its sword and pointed it at us?" At dawn, another raid was launched, but it was repelled by the infantry. Shortly afterwards, 2 messengers arrived, telling Romanos that a group of Oghuz Turks defected and joined the Sultan, and that Alparslan himself wanted to discuss peace terms. The peace talks went on for some time, but the emperor was aware that should he sign any kind of deal, he would be facing a rebellion back in Constantinople. So he abruptly ended the talks and signaled for his men to form up.
And this is another example of, as we mentioned earlier, sort of the interplay between having external threats and domestic threats. In this case, Romanus is thinking, well, I can either deal with this external threat or an internal threat. You know, if I make peace here, which may be desirable, I'll be facing a rebellion. Or I can fight right here, right now. And if I win, I will be very popular back home. And obviously he's made the judgment that that would be the better option. You know, he'd rather fight the Seljuks here than make peace and possibly face dissent back home and perhaps be overthrown. So that's the choice he's made.
Romanos took the center with the cavalry and Varangian guards. The western tagmata made up the left wing, while the right wing was comprised of the eastern units. Finally, the rear was commanded by Andronikos Doukas, the nephew of Constantine X and member of the family which despised Romanos. His presence on the campaign was an attempt to ease tensions, but also as a guarantee that his father would not start an uprising in the capital.
Yeah.
The Seljuks deployed their units in a crescent formation, protruding at the wings, with Alparslan leading the center. Romanos, who was an experienced commander and capable fighter, slowly advanced on the enemy under constant arrow fire as they withdrew. Smaller engagements were fought, but eventually, by the end of the afternoon, the Seljuks were pushed back and the Sultan's camp was captured. Romanos quickly realized that his army was losing cohesion and was afraid that if he didn't reform the line in time, the enemy would rampage throughout his camp under the veil of darkness. So he ordered the imperial standard to be reversed, which was the command to withdraw. The fatigued, disorganized, and distant wings were confused by this, and some misinterpreted it as a signal that Romanos had fallen.
Yeah. I mean, what Romanos is trying to do makes sense. He's trying to reconsolidate his forces, but of course, this is the 11th century. He cannot communicate that directly to all of his subordinates, so he has to try his best to communicate in a simple way. Unfortunately, it is misinterpreted. So, this is sort of the issue with this form of communication. Even though what Romanos is trying to do is probably a good idea, it looks like it's going to end up, hurting his chances.
Gaps began to open, and the reserve Seljuk force pounced at the opportunity to go through them and surround the Roman forces, who had just marched over 10 kilometers in heavy armor and were struggling to organize a withdrawal. Seeing this, the rest of the Seljuk forces also rejoined the fight, and it wasn't long before both wings collapsed and began to flee, leaving the center surrounded. The standard was once again reversed in an attempt to rally the troops, but by then it was too late. The only hope left lay in the hands of the rearguard and the Doukas family, who could prevent total disaster, as most of the men were not captured or slain, but merely retreated. It was in that crucial moment when Andronikos announced that the emperor was dead and marched his men to Constantinople, spreading the word of the death of Romanos through the cities he passed along the way.
Yeah, I mean, this is not terribly surprising. When they described the beef between their families, you could kind of see where that was going. Once again, it touches on, Romanos is facing internal threats within his own army. He's facing this sort of insubordination from men that he really needs to be loyal to him. This touches on, like I was saying, the composition of the army, made up of different groups, different interest groups. And at a time like this, you can see how it's very clearly detrimental to the cohesion of the army.
Back in the camp, the non-combatants were utterly confused and reported it was like an earthquake, with howling, grief, sudden fear, clouds of dust, and finally hordes of Turks riding all around. As darkness set in, Romanos, who had fought despite fatigue and wounds, was captured and his camp was ransacked. Most escaped as the riders were hesitant to blindly chase after the enemy on the mountain roads. And so the young Seljuk Empire matched the Sassanids in capturing a Roman emperor not far from the last time it occurred in Edessa 811 years ago. But rather than killing or humiliating his captive, Alparslan treated him well and with respect. A famous exchange, reported by chroniclers on both sides, quickly followed, as Alparslan asked how he would have been treated if he was captured, to which Romanos replied that he would be killed in a cruel manner. The Sultan instead offered to return Romanos to his home, dressed in the fine clothing of a Seljuk noble, with an escort and any prisoners he wanted to be freed.
Wow. Shout out, I guess. Look, you can critique the decision making, but there's clearly no lack of courage here. You know what I mean? And there seems to be, at least at this point, some element of mutual respect. Romanos, did he clearly made some mistakes along the way, and there was some insubordination he had to deal with, but, he clearly fought hard and fought bravely, so you can give him that much.
A peace treaty was signed, but we will never know if the Sultan anticipated what happened next, for it was the release of a presumed dead Romanos that did irreparable damage to the empire. Back in Constantinople, the nobles immediately tried to distance themselves from their defeated leader and deposed him, quickly replacing.
Well, I'm sure Alp Arslan knew that this was going to cause chaos. I'm sure there was some respect there, but I sincerely doubt he did this out of the goodness of his heart. He knew that this was going to cause chaos and disruption within the empire.
Him with Michael VII Ducas, who exiled his mother Eudokia. They were well aware that Romanos still commanded respect among the soldiers, and began assembling their own army to defeat him by exploiting the countryside, since the royal treasury was empty. The Norman mercenary Robert was taken out of his cell and led a makeshift army that met Romanos in battle and defeated him, at the expense of many Roman lives. The civil war was brief, and ended with the capture of the once mighty commander who pleaded for mercy while he was blinded. An infection quickly set in, and Romanos died soon after.
See, we have the internal challenges again. They really do you no benefit when you have, enemies trying to conquer your empire. You've got Romans killing Romans. This does no help to your overall strength as an empire.
Economy and manpower of the empire were exhausted, and morale was at an all-time low. The Seljuks overran a squabbling state riddled with usurpers and rebellion, and by the end of the decade, the Byzantine heartland was lost. It was in this climate of desperation that a new dynasty would rise and turn towards the west for aid when all seemed lost, hoping for financial or military assistance. Instead, a new chapter would begin as Alexios Komnenos opened the floodgates to the Crusaders. We're soon going to release the second episode in our series on the First Crusade, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, comment.
Alright, go check out their video. That was an interesting one. I honestly had forgotten that it was even about the Crusades until the very end when we, brought it all back. So yeah, that was interesting. It was definitely an education for me in 11th century Eastern Roman history, which I know next to nothing about. We were definitely dropped into the middle of it, but we got some valuable information, and we got some background and context for the upcoming Crusade, which is what this series is actually about. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this one, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, check out the Patreon, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are all having a good day, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye, everybody.